Let's dive in on our lymphatic and immune systems. As I like to do once in a while, or in a lot of our lectures, I include a picture that kind of pertains to the lecture on the very first title page. Anybody recognize this fella here? Not necessarily him personally, but him as a whole. Anybody seen a picture of a guy like this before? Where do you see these fellas? Anybody know? Guarding Buckingham Palace, where the Queen of England is, right? Okay, you see them in movies all the time because they are kind of very stoic, standing outside the castle and standing still, not moving, not flinching, not sneezing. Okay, they are guards protecting a very important person in that country. Yes?
Okay, on our lab, it says it will only be 1 through 4.
Okay, we'll have to check.
So,
It should be 1 through 7.
okay, I'll just do some in a second.
Okay, the reason I include this fella on this page is because our lymphatic, and more so the immune system, is responsible for protecting us. So that is a kind of theme I'll use. I'll use kind of guard, or even I'll talk about how like the military protects us in this lecture. Now, the first couple slides of this lecture, I'm going to kind of talk more about the lymphatic system. The immune system and the lymphatic system really kind of overlap. The immune system refers to responses of our body to protect us. And a lot of those responses, those immune responses, take place within what we call lymphatic organs. So some textbooks, completely separate them from one another. And, that's where you get the, 12 systems of the body. And other textbooks, like our textbook, actually kind of combines them as one system, which is why our textbook says there's 11 systems of the body. Okay. So I kind of just say lymphatic and immune systems kind of separately, but know that there's, that connection between the two. Within our lymphatic system is a fluid called lymph. We've also got vessels called lymphatic vessels that transport our lymph, as well as a number of structures and organs containing lymphatic tissue. Red bone marrow, which we talked about the other day, where we produce our blood cells, which includes our major soldiers of the immune system. We also talked about those the other day, lymphocytes. Our lymphatic system is designed to maintain a balance of fluid in our internal environment, and is considered a component of our circulatory system because it consists of moving fluid derived from our blood in a group of vessels that return it to our general circulation. When I say general circulation, I'm talking about returning it back to the blood. Okay. We talked about the other day the fact that when water leaves the blood, it becomes interstitial fluid. It then comes back into our blood, becoming blood again, right? Well, sometimes fluid gets picked up instead by our lymphatic system. So the first function you can see there listed is draining excess interstitial fluid, because sometimes we pull water not back into the blood, but into our lymphatic vessels. And all of our lymphatic vessels eventually drain into 2 spots just above our heart, giving that fluid back to our blood. So that's why it says returning it to the blood. Now, while that takes place, while we circulate that lymphatic fluid back towards our heart, we circulate that water, what we call lymph at this point, through our lymph nodes, where we carry out a lot of our immune responses. And within our lymph nodes are very, very important immune cells, like lymphocytes and macrophages that we introduced the other day, where we can detect any harmful substances or cells and, kind of try to get rid of them. Something that we'll talk about later in the semester when we talk about the digestive tract is that we absorb our fats and fat-soluble vitamins A, D, E, and K into our lymphatic system, which is unique because when we absorb water and proteins and non-fat substances like carbohydrates and electrolytes, those go through the walls of our intestines into the bloodstream. Whereas, and I don't really know why, never really researched it, but fats and fat-soluble vitamins, they get pulled not into blood vessels, but into lymphatic vessels, what we call lacteals. Now, eventually those fats get drained into the blood, just like what I've been talking about, but it's not a direct route straight into the blood like we do with our carbohydrates, our amino acids, our water, and so on and so forth. So we'll talk about that more later in the semester. Basic components of our lymphatic system includes interstitial fluid that we talked about the other day, fluid that fills spaces between our cells. Plasma that does not get reabsorbed by the circulatory system becomes part of the interstitial fluid. Lymph, a colorless water-appearing fluid originating as interstitial fluid that has been taken up by our lymphatic vessels. And then lymphoid tissue, which is a type of tissue within our lymphatic system containing lymphocytes and other defense cells, ultimately forming the structures known as lymph nodes that I'll talk about here in a bit. Let's talk more about lymph here on this page. Okay, I've already kind of talked about this first little bit here, but most components of our blood plasma filter freely through capillary walls to form interstitial fluid, but more fluid flows out of our capillaries than returns to them by reabsorption. This excess filtered fluid, about 3 liters a day, which is not a lot in the grand scheme of things, drains into our lymphatic vessels, becoming lymph. Okay, within our lymph are proteins, which are typically unable to be reabsorbed in the capillaries. And unlike our cardiovascular system, our lymphatic system does not have a central pumping organ connected to our lymphatic vessels. So we have to use some kind of other methods and other organ systems to assist in lymph movement. What is the central pumping organ of our cardiovascular system? Our heart. Our heart pumps our blood, helps it leave the heart, come back to the heart. It's all related to pressure. Okay? And we'll talk about that here in our upcoming lectures. We don't have a heart associated with our lymphatic system, so we use some other methods to get lymph back towards the heart. What we have are a respiratory pump and a muscle pump. The respiratory pump helps move blood and also lymph. I don't know why it says blood, not lymph, but we move our blood and lymph up against the force of gravity because water and blood and lymph in our body is under the same circumstances that fluids outside our body are when it comes to gravity. If you take a cup of water and you tip it over, what's going to happen? Water's going to fall on the floor, right? Well, the fluids inside of us, when we're standing up, are pulled towards the feet, just like fluids outside of us. So we're trying to bring that lymph, same thing for blood, up against the force of gravity. Well, as we breathe, we change pressure inside of our thoracic cavity, and that actually kind of helps suck the fluid up from below, which is kind of cool. All movement of fluid inside of us is regulated by pressure. We've talked about concentration gradients a lot in this class, right? How we like to go from high to low. Well, fluids go from high to low pressure. So where there's higher pressure, fluid is going to flow from that area to lower pressure. So when we breathe and pressure drops in our thoracic cavity, if it drops below pressure in our abdomen, that fluid is going to flow up against the force of gravity, which is really cool. Okay. Now, to also help, and this is especially important like in our legs, when we contract our muscles are going to squeeze our lymphatic vessels, and they do the same thing with our veins to force the lymph and blood, if we're talking about veins, upwards. Okay? Think of like milking a cow. When you squeeze on the udders, the milk shoots out, right? Even if you've never milked a cow, you know what I'm talking about. You see this in movies all the time. When our muscles contract, causing an increase in local pressure, driving lymph forward. When our muscles relax, it drops local pressure and new lymph flows in, and the process can start again. So it's like ejection, pushing it forward. Now, both lymphatic vessels and our veins have valves that allow the fluid to flow forward, but not backwards, which is really cool because it would be really terrible if the fluid went up our muscle relaxed and then it dropped right back down. It'd be very difficult. And what we'd have is pooling of blood and lymph in our feet. We don't want that. Okay. Now, we'll talk more about the flow of blood and how we use these same two pumps to move blood in our veins or to promote what we call venous return. We'll do that here in our last lecture of Unit 5. All right, let's talk about the cells of our immune system. The main cells of our immune system are those leukocytes or white blood cells that we introduced the other day. General function of them is to combat pathogens that have entered our tissues of the body. 5 types of leukocytes, each playing a specific role in immunity. They include our neutrophils, which are phagocytes, cells that engage in phagocytosis, process by which microbes and cell debris are engulfed and destroyed. Among leukocytes, neutrophils respond most quickly to destruction or tissue destruction by bacteria, which is why the other day I called them our first responders. Okay. Eosinophils destroy parasites such as worms that enter our body tissues. Accomplish this task by attaching to the parasite and then releasing toxic substances. They also, unfortunately, contribute to allergic reactions, which is very annoying, as we all know about allergies. They can also function as phagocytes, but their phagocytic activity is weak compared to the other types of phagocytes of our immune system. Our third and final granulocyte are our basophils, which release a variety of chemicals, including histamine, leukotrienes, and prostaglandins, which promote inflammation and are also involved in allergic reactions. Then we've got our monocytes and lymphocytes, what we call the agranulocytes. Monocytes, we remember talking about this the other day, hopefully anyway, travel to sites of infection, but then differentiate into large phagocytic cells called macrophages, which I always call the Pac-Man cells of the body. We learned the other day that there are wandering macrophages that migrate from tissue to tissue. There's also fixed macrophages that stand guard in specific tissues, places like our liver, our spleen, etc. And then we also talked the other day that our lymphocytes are the major soldiers of our immune system. And there are 3 types of those lymphocytes, or 3 types of lymphocytes: B cells, T cells, and natural killer cells. And all that's a review of what we talked about the other day, which is handy because it's getting you ready for Friday. Now, to defend against pathogens that have entered our body tissues, many leukocytes leave our bloodstream through blood capillary walls and collect in interstitial spaces between cells at sites of pathogen evasion or inflammation. We talked about this the other day. That was called immigration, and that our cells are attracted to those areas of trauma. We call that chemotaxis. Okay. When neutrophils, eosinophils, basophils, and monocytes leave our bloodstream to fight injury or infection, they never return to it. Lymphocytes, on the other hand, continually recirculate from our blood to interstitial fluid to lymph and back to the blood. Only 2% of our total lymphocyte population is circulating our blood at any given time. The rest are going to be in places like our lymphoid organs and tissues that we'll talk about here in a minute. In addition to those white blood cells, there are 2 other types of cells that are part of our immune system. And I kind of talked about the first ones the other day. I did not mention anything about the dendritic cells, though. Mast cells are widely dispersed in our body, particularly in our connective tissues, places like our skin, the linings of our respiratory and GI tracts, which are places that are really susceptible to exposure to microbes and toxins and that kind of stuff when we breathe, when we drink, when we eat. Like basophils, mast cells release histamine and other substances involved in inflammation and allergic reactions. There's also dendritic cells, the ones that are shown down here at the bottom right, located in our skin and other organs of the body, serving as antigen-presenting cells, which are cells that process antigens, which we talked about in that previous lecture, are foreign substances, then present those antigens to lymphocytes to promote an immune response. And I kind of think of those like as the tattletales of the immune system. And they're the ones that rat out the people that shouldn't, or the not people, but the cells and foreign substances that shouldn't be there. Say, hey, come destroy this, whatever it is, bacteria, virus, toxin. It's not supposed to be here. All right, let's talk about the lymphatic organs or lymphoid organs and tissues where we have lymphocytes or where immune systems or immune responses take place. We can classify our lymphoid organs and tissues into two groups based on their functions, the primaries and the secondaries. Primary lymphatic organs are sites where stem cells divide and become what we call immunocompetent. Term that describes their ability to mount an immune response. This includes our red bone marrow and our thymus. Now, immunocompetency is something I like to kind of think of in relationship to soldiers when they join the military. Whatever branch of the military it is, I'm not going to really get into, Marines, Army, that kind of stuff. But when a person signs on that dotted line, are they eligible and ready to go directly off to battle? Where do they go first? Basic training, right? Basic training is where, the soldier becomes a soldier, right? They get trained in whatever it is they're going to be doing. And when they are done with basic training, they are a competent soldier, right? This is exactly what is taking place with our lymphocytes in our red bone marrow and thymus. They are becoming mature cells that are ready to go off to battle. And when soldiers go off to battle, they don't battle right there at basic training. They get shipped off somewhere else, right? A lot of times it's overseas. That's where the secondary lymphatic organs and tissues come into play. The sites where most immune responses occur, places like our lymph nodes, our spleen, and our lymphatic nodules, which includes things like our tonsils and our appendix. Let's talk about the thymus, one of the two primary lymphatic organs. Our thymus is an organ we've actually mentioned before. Back in our endocrine lecture, we learned that it produces several hormones: thymic humoral factor and thymosin, thymopoietin. Talk about that here a little bit more in just a second. Let's just read a little bit here about the thymus. It's a bilobed organ just above our heart in the mediastinum, surrounded by a capsule. And the capsule actually penetrates inward and separates the two lobes into lobules. Okay, so a lobule is just a functional unit of a thymus. There are many lobules in our thymus, both lobes. Here's what a lobule looks like. Okay. Our thymus can be described as a very important site of immunity in children and is a very large reservoir of lymphocytes, most notably our T cells, which are where they become those competent soldiers. Okay, so it's kind of handy. T cells or T lymphocytes develop and mature in our thymus. Now, T cells do not originate in our thymus. Where do all of our blood cells come from? Our red bone marrow. But they come to the thymus to get ready to go off to battle. Okay. Two parts make up each thymic lobule: an outer cortex and a central medulla, which we can see are bracketed off here in our picture. The cortex is composed of a large number of various cells, what we call immature, or they're labeled here in our picture as pre-T cells, which are the soldiers that have just signed on the dotted line and are ready to go into basic training. So they're arriving here from our red bone marrow, where they can proliferate and begin to mature. There's also those dendritic cells that we can see kind of in yellow, derived from monocytes that help with T cell maturation. And then there's also specialized epithelial cells that help educate the T cells through a process called positive selection. They're the ones that produce the thymic hormones that we learned about that help with T cell maturation. There's also even macrophages that clear out any dead and dying cells from our thymic cortex. Then the medulla is where you find widely scattered more mature T cells, epithelial cells, dendritic cells, and macrophages. So a lot of the same cells, except the T cells are now mature and are ready to go off into battle, which once again is not going to take place in the thymus, but somewhere else, places like our lymph nodes and spleen, which means we're going to have to leave the thymus, those cells will, and they do so by jumping into the bloodstream like you show right here. Okay. So the mature T cells migrate to the medulla from the cortex. From here, the T cells exit the thymus. They do so via blood that migrates them to the lymph nodes, the spleen, and other lymphatic tissues, where they can colonize the parts of these organs and tissues and then, do what they do. So I've mentioned our lymph nodes several times here this morning. Organs that are located along our lymphatic vessels. Bean-shaped to them, they have a kind of convex and a concave side. Scattered throughout our body, usually occurring in groups. We have a lot of them in groups in places like our neck, what we call our cervical lymph nodes. These are the ones that a lot of times when you're sick and go to the doctor feels for, rubbing on your neck to see if they're inflamed. We have them in our armpits. We call those the axillaries. They're in our groin. Those will be in the guinals and in the female mammary glands as well. Looking at our picture here on the right, it shows the internal features of a lymph node, where we find a large number of cells that include both T and B lymphocytes, dendritic cells that we've mentioned several times here already, and macrophages. Okay. Now, it's really cool what takes place within our lymph nodes. Basically, the function of a lymph node is to act like a filter. Okay. Filtering out microbes and other foreign substances that are found in our lymph. The way that our lymph nodes are built is to help slow down the flow of that lymph that passes through them. And lymph comes into a lymph node by way of several afferent lymphatic vessels, which are located here on this side of a lymph node. And like a thymus, or like our thymus, there's a capsule on the outside, but more importantly, that capsule penetrates inward and creates these sinuses, which are these like irregular channels or kind of like a maze situation inside the lymph node. What this means is when the lymph comes into the lymph node, it's not going to just flow through here really fast. It's going to have to zigzag on its way through, which makes the flow of lymph really slow through the node so that those different lymphocytes, macrophages, and dendritic cells can do what they do. Because if the lymph was flowing through really fast, it would be like trying to go through Taco Bell's drive-through going 30 miles an hour. Would you be able to give your money and get your food? No, you pass right through it, right? So we have to slow down for this to take place. So that as the lymph flows through the node, the macrophages can destroy the microbes by phagocytosis. Lymphocytes can destroy the others by a variety of immune responses. However, if too many microorganisms enter the nodes, phagocytes cannot destroy enough of them, and infection results, which infection of a node is called adenitis, which is fairly common. Unfortunately, lymph nodes are very tied in a lot of times with cancer, because cancer cells can break away from their malignant tumor in our lymph nodes where they can become lodged, causing blockage of flow, and can also begin to form a new tumor as the cells begin to divide. This can show up as a large node, usually can be palpated by a physician, and a lot of times happens in the breasts of a female because there are so many lymph nodes in there, which is why self-breast exam is very important for you ladies out there. Okay, our next organ is an organ we have not talked about this semester, Our spleen is actually our largest lymphatic organ, located just below the diaphragm and a little bit to the side and behind our stomach, posterior lateral to it. Contains a wide variety of cells that include lymphocytes, macrophages, and dendritic cells, so a lot of the same cells that we just saw in our lymph nodes. Just like our lymph nodes, it's surrounded by a capsule with inward extensions that help divide it into compartments and create kind of two distinctive tissues, what we call the white pulp and the red pulp of our spleen. The white pulp is where you find lymphatic tissue. Mainly we have lymphocytes, macrophages, and this is where our filtering of the blood takes place. So white pulp is a lot like our lymph nodes in that we filter. The difference is what we're filtering. When we just saw on the previous page, we filter our lymph nodes, we're filtering what fluid? Lymph. In our spleen, the white pulp is filtering our blood. As it states there, as blood passes through our spleen, B cells and T cells carry out their immune responses. Macrophages destroy microbes by phagocytosis. The red pulp is going to consist of blood-filled venous sinuses and cords of splenic tissue called splenic cords, which consist of red blood cells, macrophages, lymphocytes, plasma cells, and the 3 granulocytes. So that would be the basophils, neutrophils, and eosinophils. Within our red pulp, the spleen performs 3 functions that are related to our blood cells. We remove worn out or defective blood cells and platelets by macrophages. We actually kind of talked, just briefly mentioned that on Monday when we talked about the life cycle of red blood cells. We store up to 1/3 of our body supply of platelets in our spleen. And we learned this as well on Monday, that during fetal life, we go through hemopoiesis or hematopoiesis in our spleen. But as we know, the spleen is not the site of blood cell production towards the end of pregnancy, towards the end of fetal life, and then for the rest of our life, our red bone marrow, as we talked about, is the site of blood cell production. Interestingly enough, if a child has a splenectomy, meaning that they remove their spleen, which is, not too uncommon, lymph nodes in the abdominal cavity enlarge and become splenic in function. Once again, just displaying and reemphasizing how amazing and adaptable our body is, which is amazing. Now, not to be confused with lymph nodes, are our lymphatic nodules. Lymph nodes were surrounded by a capsule, but more importantly, they filtered our lymph. Lymphatic nodules are not surrounded by a capsule, and they do not filter our lymph, but they contain those same cells that we've been talking about, lymphocytes, macrophages, and dendritic cells. We find our lymphatic nodules in what we call the lamina propria, which is a fancy term for the type of connective tissue of our mucous membranes, of our gastrointestinal, urinary, respiratory, and reproductive tracts. Since they are associated with mucous membranes, another term for lymphatic nodules are mucosa-associated lymphoid tissues, or MALT. Simple as they're associated with mucosa, mucous membranes. What they do is protect against bacteria and other pathogens that may enter our body passages with food, air, or urine. And most of the time they're small and solitary, but there are places where they occur in large aggregations, and thus they get a special name. This includes our Pyrus patches, which are found in the mucosa lining the ileum of our small intestine and carry out immune responses against microbes that have invaded our GI tract. Kind of the same thing is our appendix, except it's at the end of our small intestine, more so actually at the beginning of our large intestine. where they carry out immune responses against microbes invading our GI tract. And then the tonsils, which there are typically 5, found in the mucosa lining our pharynx or throat, strategically positioned to participate in immune responses against inhaled or ingested microbes. Now, I mentioned on the previous page about a splenectomy. Much more common are appendectomies and tonsillectomies, which would be removal of an appendix or removal of some of maybe, all of the tonsils. Pretty common procedures. Imagine, I'm not going to ask you guys to reveal your medical history. I imagine some of you have gone through some of those procedures. And I assume everybody recovered just fine and their immune system is functioning just fine. Just demonstrating that these things are just like extra protection. A lot of people think that the appendix has no job. That's not true. It's just not a super important job because we've got much more important organs like our spleen and our lymph nodes that do more of the filtering, more of the protecting. So we survive just fine without tonsils, without appendixes. In fact, I imagine there are people walking around that don't have an appendix or their tonsils. So. Okay, at this point, we are going to transition away from talking about the organs where our immune responses take place to now actually talking about our immune responses. So I just want to define right away here what immunity is. The resistance or immunity or resistance can be used interchangeably. Our ability to ward off damage or disease through our defenses. Vulnerability or a lack of resistance is termed susceptibility, which hopefully we don't have a whole lot of susceptibility. Unfortunately, we do, at least to some degree, some more than others. Our immune system consists of innate mechanisms that confer a non-specific defense against what we call pathogens. Pathogens are just anything that can cause disease. So that could be viruses, bacteria, fungi. There's also adaptive immune responses that allow us to defend against specific molecular targets or what we call antigens. So we can kind of describe our immunity as 2 types, innate or nonspecific and adaptive or specific. The term innate means that you're born with it. As it says right there, the first bullet, it's present at birth. It includes our external physical and chemical barriers. So this is your skin. The mucous membranes, like the snot in your nose, mucus that's in your mouth and throat, as well as some more internal defenses. The term non-specific means that we don't have a specific recognition of invaders, meaning there's no memory component. This is not why we get the flu shot. It's not why we get vaccines. Because vaccines are built, or are to help build, I should say, our adaptive or specific immune system. What our innate or non-specific immune system provides us is protection the same way against whatever it is. It doesn't matter if it's virus, bacteria, it's going to go at it the same way no matter what. And there's 2 lines of defense, just like what we see in the military, first and second lines of defense. Okay. But those are not 100% impenetrable, which means that, virus or bacteria might invade us to where we might have to call upon our adaptive or specific immune system, which has a specific recognition of invaders with a memory component. And that enables us to mount an immune response that's much quicker if we're exposed a second time. And that's why we get vaccines, which are absolutely essential for society to get. I'm very anti-vaccine, very pro-vaccination. And adaptive immunity is performed by lymphocytes that target specific molecular targets known as, once again, antigens, which are those kind of molecular signatures that we find on our pathogens that are, like viruses and bacteria. So the difference between innate and adaptive immunity can be understood by examining the receptor proteins on the cell surface, providing each category of immunity. The innate immune system responds to molecules characteristic of invading microorganisms, such as bacteria, but not of human cells. Whereas the adaptive immune system response is mounted against very specific molecular targets, or once again, we use that term, antigens, usually foreign molecules, but also can be molecules produced by human cells, which can be an issue causing things like autoimmune disorders, like type 1 diabetes and multiple sclerosis, which we'll talk a little bit about in this lecture towards the end. All right, we'll start with our innate immune system, the first line of defense, which includes external physical and chemical barriers, discouraging microbes and other foreign substances from penetrating our body and causing disease. Our skin is a very formidable physical barrier to the entrance of foreign substances into body tissues. For those of you who have taken anatomy, you've learned about the skin. We didn't really talk much about the skin in this class. We don't get into it too much. Part of the integumentary system, but it's made up of two parts, the epidermis, which is the outer part, and the inner dermis. Most of the cells of our epidermis are keratinocytes, which are epithelial cells containing keratin, a tough fibrous protein, which protects the skin and underlying tissues from heat, microbes, and chemicals. The keratinocytes that form our epidermis are very tightly packed together, helping our skin resist invasion by microbes, so it's not like they're going to be able to just weasel their way in. In addition, our keratinocytes also release a water repellent sealant that decreases water entry and inhibits the entry of foreign materials. Now, we are continuously shedding our epidermis. Whenever we scratch, whenever we rub our skin, we are flaking away epidermal layers, or epidermal skin cells, I should say, not layers. We replace the entirety of our epidermis about once every 4 weeks, which means that, if we get something stuck to our skin, whether it's supposed to be there or not, the shedding of these keratinocytes can actually help get rid of it. Our skin is especially susceptible to like fungus, which is what causes ringworm, that kind of stuff. Two other types of cells in our epidermis have protective roles. We have what we call Langerhans cells, which are a type of dendritic cell, alert the immune system to the presence of microbes that invade our skin, and melanocytes that protect our skin from damaging effects of UV radiation. UV radiation that comes from the sun or from tanning beds, if you choose to do so, which I highly recommend against using those. Although the epidermis contributes the most to our skin's ability to serve as physical barriers to microbes, the dermis does play a role as well. For example, we have microbes in our dermis that phagocytize bacteria and viruses that manage to migrate through the epidermis into the dermis. Because our epidermis is super thin, it's pretty easy to, cut through it or poke through it. Just, just grabbing a piece of paper wrong can slice your skin. Other physical barriers act to block the entrance of microbes into our body tissues. The lining of our respiratory, GI, so that's the gastrointestinal, reproductive, and urinary tracts secrete mucus, which is a sticky substance that traps microbes and foreign substances. Our nose has mucus-coated hairs that trap and filter microbes, dust, and pollutants from inhaled air. In addition to mucus, the lining of our respiratory tract contains cilia, and the action of our cilia propels inhaled dust and microbes that have become trapped in our mucus up towards our throat, where we'll either kind of cough it up and spit it out, or a lot of times what we do is dump it into our stomach to digest it. Coughing and sneezing accelerate the movement of mucus and its entrap pathogens out of the body. And as I just said, swallowing mucus sends pathogens to our stomach where we have gastric juice that helps destroy them. So those were the physical barriers. There's also chemical barriers, which includes in our skin, sebaceous or oil glands secreting sebum. Sebum is a fancy word for oil. A substance that forms a protective film over the surface of our skin. And that oily substance are unsaturated fatty acids that inhibit the growth of certain pathogenic bacteria and fungi. And if you were to take a pH sample of the skin, you'd find that it has a pretty low pH, 3 to 5, which is pretty acidic, caused in part by the secretion of the fatty acids and lactic acid. Lysozyme is an enzyme capable of breaking down the cell walls of certain bacteria, which basically is like popping a balloon. When a bacteria has a hole in it, it's basically going to die. We have lysozyme in places like our tears, so that protects against bacteria like getting into our eyes, in our mouth through saliva, our sweat, perspiration, inside our nose, and a lot of other tissues have lysozyme. We've talked about that, and actually that was mentioned in our previous lecture. The washing action of our tears, produced by lacrimal glands and channeled through our lacrimal apparatus, helps to dilute microbes and keep them from settling on the surface of our eyes. Gastric juice is produced by our glands of the stomach, a mixture of hydrochloric acid, enzyme, and mucus. It is super acidic, having a pH as low as 1.2. Most bacteria do not enjoy being exposed to that, and they are destroyed as a result, along with their toxins. In females, vaginal secretions are also slightly acidic, discouraging bacterial growth. Saliva also washes microbes from the surface of our teeth and from the mucous membranes of the mouth. Urine cleanses the urinary system and prevents colonization of microbes. And then defecation and vomiting also pretty, in some cases, violently expel microbes. Now, as I said, just like in the military, a first line of defense is not 100% effective, so we call upon a second line of defense. Our body uses kind of several different components. Part of our second lines of defense, antimicrobial substances, those natural killer cells that we've mentioned, phagocytes, and then inflammation and fever, which we have mentioned inflammation, but not so much fever quite yet. All right, let's talk about the 4 antimicrobial substances that are described here on this page. First are called interferons, abbreviated IFNs, which are proteins produced by lymphocytes, macrophages, and fibroblasts that have become infected by viruses. Okay. So here's what this illustration is showing you. A cell that's been infected by a virus. When viruses infect a cell, a lot of times they reprogram the cell, telling the cell to reproduce more viruses. And that actually can destroy the cell as a result. But interferons are produced by these different cells that have become infected by viruses. And those proteins are released from an infected cell, where they then can diffuse to uninfected neighboring cells, like this one here, where they induce the synthesis of antiviral proteins that interfere with viral replication. So these proteins that are shown here with the triangles block a virus from invading it. They also activate natural killer cells and cytotoxic T cells, which we'll talk about later in the lecture, which can kill infected body cells and cancer cells. In addition, IFNs inhibit cell division and suppress the formation of tumors. So interferons are pretty dang good at what they do. The complement system is a collection of normally inactive proteins, and it's more than 30. What we find in our blood plasma and the plasma membranes of cells. Typically, they're produced in liver, and when activated, they complement one another. Not like, hey, good job, but they complement like a domino effect, or they enhance immune reactions, meaning that they can destroy microbes through a series of mechanisms, causing phagocytosis, cytolysis, which is just a fancy word for cell death, and inflammation. And I told you they act like dominoes, one knocking down the other, acting in a cascade. Antimicrobial proteins are short peptides that have a broad spectrum of antimicrobial activity. What they do is they can help attract dendritic cells and mast cells that participate in immune responses. And then iron binding proteins do exactly what their name tells you. They bind to iron, which is something that bacteria need to help grow. So that's how they inhibit growth. The figure here on the right side of the page on the bottom shows you the complement system. These are the different proteins. What they're going to do is, like I said, bacteria can't function if they've got a hole in them. That's what they're kind of basically creating, poking a hole in the membrane of that cell, like popping a balloon. It's going to end up dying as a result. Okay, we'll stop here. Since we're out of time, we'll start with these cells, natural killer cells and phagocytes, and how they provide us a second line of defense on Monday.